We're all anxiously waiting to hear about other life forms.
Okay, well, why don't we start there, actually? That's a good place to start.
In Arabic.
So, last time we introduced a metaphysical model of the universe, which is, one could say, it's the idea of the circle of creation, the arcs of ascent and descent, which charts the endless process of the waking up of the universe, the eternal drive towards self-consciousness, which is the same as the consciousness of the divine. As Abdu'l-Baha says in one of the later chapters of Paris Talks, it all comes down to the love of God for his own essence, for through a ray of this love, all the other love comes into being. And in a completely separate, but I think related domain, the physicist John Wheeler suggests that the universe may have come into existence quantum mechanically by a recursive act of self-observation, which he calls it from bit. But that's a whole separate conversation. Before I start on today's topic, I want to return to a question that I asked at the beginning of yesterday. And the question is, what is the evidence that this way of looking at the universe is true? Well, what does it mean for any scientific theory to be true? At a minimum, it has to be consistent with all of the physical facts of the universe as they're known to us. Beyond this, we want the model to be useful. Does it solve a problem? Does it have predictive power? This is how we evaluate the truth of every scientific theory. So why don't we try to apply the same standard to this metaphysical model? And to both of these questions, yes, there's a question.
Isn't it true that a scientific theory is only true until it's disproven?
Yes.
Yeah, well, falsification is a you could say a pillar of the scientific method. You know that you can generate any theory out there, and all you have to do to disprove it is find one single counterexample. So it sets up a very strong and severe standard of proof for physical theories because they tend to be easy to falsify. And so what I'm proposing is that let's try to look at this through the same sort of scientific lens. That first of all, it can't contradict the facts of the universe, the physical facts of the universe as we know them. And it should be able to solve problems, and it should have predictive power. So if we apply that standard to this metaphysical model, I think to both of those questions, is it useful? Does it have predictive power? I believe we can answer in the affirmative. It potentially is useful in that it can solve the problem of religious diversity in the world, one of the biggest problems facing humanity, by acknowledging and validating different kinds of faith languages, by providing a big enough theological umbrella to embrace the various faith traditions that exist in the world on their own terms, without forcing them to capitulate and take on some master theology. It allows a variety of different theological perspectives to coexist. And as a bonus, I'd say, this metaphysical perspective also makes a definite and perhaps unexpected prediction about the universe. Because if consciousness is in some way built into the universe and its processes, maybe not in ways that, at least today, we can unfold in a mathematical sense, but if somehow in the apparent randomness of evolutionary processes and the apparent randomness of the movement of atoms and stars and galaxies and everything else, it just somehow tends to happen that life emerges from this apparent matrix of chaos, then we would expect life and consciousness to tend to arise wherever the conditions allow it to. In other words, we would expect the universe not to be mainly barren and lifeless, but we would expect to find life in the universe. So in other words, life, and even intelligent life, should exist in abundance throughout the universe, if this model is correct. Not necessarily every single square inch of every single planet. I mean, look at our own planet, which is teeming with life, but there are vast areas of our planet which are essentially lifeless, deserts and the North and South poles and so forth. So And as we know, the idea of the pervasiveness of life is one of the most remarkable concrete predictions in the writings of Baha'u'llah, that every fixed star hath its planets and every planet hath its creatures. Actually, in this idea that every fixed star hath its planets was only in fairly recent times, with the launching of various satellites dedicated to the observation, detection of extrasolar planets, only in our lifetimes and in our fairly recent times has it become clear that actually planets are far more common than some skeptics might have thought before. I mean, there was some scientific question on that. Maybe planets are kind of a rare thing. Well, now it is known, and again, fairly recently, that planets are just as common as can be. We don't know yet anything about life. I mean, one of the, I think, greatest discoveries of our civilization would be if life were to be observed at some stage of evolution around some distant star. And that's one possible scientific discovery which I eagerly await, in my own lifetime. I really hope it will happen in my own lifetime. And I pin that hope partly on this theological stance that I have, that life in consciousness is abundant because the universe wants to be alive. The universe wants to evolve to the state of self-knowledge. So,
Stephen?
yes.
Did you just mention the quotation, every fixed star has planets and every planet has creatures?
Yes.
Okay.
That's a quote from Baha'u'llah in
Yes, I'm aware of that quote.
Yes.
So we're making the assumption not only are they prevalent, but there's creatures on all of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, do we take him literally when he says every? And are there creatures on Mercury? Are there creatures surrounding planets whose stars have just gone supernova? Of course not. So I mean, there have to be exceptions. I mean, it can't be every in that sort of sense. Yeah.
Potential? That they're potentially there?
Right. So there's a lot of ways one could go with this. One could say, life can potentially be there. One can also say, well, creatures can be anything.
Yeah.
Rocks are creatures
life
of God.
forms.
Yes.
Then Shoghi Effendi that said that there are planets more advanced than ours. Matter of fact, they consider Earth the tail of the dog because they still have war.
Yeah, there are a number of pilgrim notes of people who have heard Shoghi Effendi say various things about life on other planets, including the idea that there's life more advanced than ours, including the idea that intelligent life, may be discovered within a few thousand years. A contact may be made, that we may then join a larger society, an even greater configuration of consciousness, which would just be, very Star Trek-y, perhaps. Hopefully Star Trek and not some other dystopian sci-fi view. It's very
Hopefully not fireflies, what you're saying.
right. Yeah.
What is a fixed star?
A fixed star, I believe in the context in which the quotation was made, would basically be what we call stars. I mean, by fixed star, because they're fixed because in the sky they don't move around. I mean, the stars that move in our sky are actually planets. So if you talk about the fixed stars, you're talking about what astronomically you simply call stars. They're just, they're fixed in our sky. Of course, over thousands of years, none of them are actually fixed, but they're just moving on timescales too slow for us to really notice. Yeah. So, this isn't what I wanted to mainly talk about today, although this topic could easily, because there's actually so much written about it in the Baha'i writings, and Abdu'l-Baha goes on and comments on Baha'u'llah's statement about creatures, and he comments on the nature of these creatures, and it's quite interesting. But I promised instead to spend the last 2 days talking first about the individual dimensions of this picture of the circle of existence, that is individual spiritual life, the mystical experience. And then tomorrow to talk about our collective experience traversing this circle of existence. And we'll get into questions of world order and the present scene. And so in doing so, we're going to be taking the circle of existence from this very universal view that we've been at over the last couple of days, looking at it, kind of all at once, to a very particular view. You can see it as in personal sense, but you can also see it from the inside, from those of us, which is all of us, who are participating and traversing this circle of life. What is the experience of traversing the circle of existence, of ascending the stages of the arc of ascent? Of course, we can't get into the consciousness of a rock or a plant or a bat, so we start with human experience. I can only speak from my own human experience, and so what follows naturally is my own very subjective or personal understanding of these topics, to be taken only if it is useful to you. So, in thinking about the individual's spiritual path along the arc of ascent, let our starting point be what we might call a certain received notion of spirituality, the idea that comes at us through the matrix of our surrounding religious matrix of Christianity and Islam. The idea that the spiritual path is all about ascending from the darkness of doubt into the light of certitude, the passage from unbelief to belief. This is very familiar to the followers of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's a kind of a two-step process. You begin in ignorance and you see the light. You're born again. You're born into the life of faith. And so it's a spiritual journey of one step, I suppose. And the entrance to the city of certitude, as described by Baha'u'llah, would be, in the Kitab-i-Iqan, would be, I think, recognizable by a Christian as the process of being born again, the way he describes it. And I think most of us in this room are familiar with how Baha'u'llah describes the entrance to the city of certitude in the second half of the Kitab-i-Iqan. He says, and this is only part of it, he says, "At that hour will the mystic herald bearing the joyful tidings of the Spirit shine forth from the city of God, resplendent as the morn, and through the trumpet blast of knowledge will awaken the heart, the soul, and the spirit from the slumber of negligence. Then will the manifold favors and outpouring grace of the holy and everlasting Spirit confer such new life upon the seeker that he will find himself endowed with a new eye, a new ear, a new heart, and a new mind. He will contemplate the manifest signs of the universe and will penetrate the hidden mysteries of the soul. Gazing with the eye of God, he will perceive within every atom a door that leadeth him to the stations of absolute certitude. He will discover in all things the mysteries of divine revelation and the evidences of an everlasting manifestation." Abdu'l-Baha is even more explicit in his usage of the Christian vocabulary of spiritual rebirth in his various talks and tablets. And one example of this is in the Promulgation of Universal Peace. This is on pages 304 to 305. He says, "If he is baptized with the Holy Spirit, if he is freed from the bondage of nature, released from animalistic tendencies, and advanced in the human realm, he is fitted to enter into the divine kingdom. The world of the kingdom is the realm of divine bestowals and the bounties of God. It is attainment to the highest virtues of humanity. It is nearness to God. It is capacity to receive the bounties of the ancient Lord. When man advances to this station, he attains the second birth. If he attains to rebirth while in the world of nature, he will become informed of the divine world. He will observe that another and a higher world exists. Wonderful bounties descend, eternal life awaits, everlasting glory surrounds him. All the signs of reality and greatness are there. He will see the lights of God. All these experiences will be his when he is born out of the world of nature into the world divine. Therefore, for the perfect man, there are two kinds of birth. The first physical birth is from the matrix of the mother. The second, or spiritual birth, is from the world of nature." And there are innumerable passages in the Baha'i writings, both from Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha, on this theme, which tends to portray the spiritual journey as as this leap, almost this instantaneous leap of grace into the life of the Spirit. But, yes.
Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress.
Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress.
Pilgrim's Progress, yeah. Which is very similar, I mean, going into depth, but the same idea of the man Christian goes off and goes through all these things to the city of God.
Yeah. Well, the hero's journey, the monomyth, one goes out into the wilderness and becomes transformed and comes back reborn. This idea of, yes?
Yes, thank you. You said the physical birth was from the matrix of the mother.
Yes.
And then the spiritual birth, the second birth was
From the world of nature. From the world of nature into the realm of the Spirit.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a but. And I think the but to this is beautiful. This is inspiring. Some of the most inspiring passages, I think, in the Baha'i writings describe this, the lights of God which descend upon the soul. And one reads these and one yearns to have that experience, to have that mystical experience. At the same time, there is a dark side to it. What could the dark side be? There's something so amazing and wonderful. From a tool for self-reflection, it can potentially be degraded into a game of judging, of categorizing other people as either believers or non-believers. It can become a serious problem when entire groups of people become so categorized. The world then becomes divided into the community of the saved, the residents of the shining city on the hill, and the legions of the benighted and the damned. Arguably, it is the source of the primary sickness that afflicts the human race today, the sickness of religious disunity, of tribalism, of othering. In its most extreme manifestations, it leads to the denial of the essential humanity of the other, and is the motive cause of all the religious wars and bloodshed throughout history. So how can something so inspiring and beautiful and necessary to complete the chain of being in the circle of existence become so terrible? For we can only create the world anew if we are first created anew. Abdu'l-Baha, I think, gives us some insight in The Secret of Divine Civilization. He says the principles of the divine religions can hardly be evaluated by the acts of those who only claim to follow them. For every excellent thing, peerless though it may be, can still be diverted to the wrong ends. A lighted lamp in the hands of an ignorant child or of the blind will not dispel the surrounding darkness nor light up the house. It will set both the bearer and the house on fire. So this takes us back to a point that was made in the first session. Ideas, how we see the world, how we understand other people, how we, these sorts of theoretical considerations have consequences in the world. Ideas are the driving force of history. Are there other ways of thinking about the spiritual path that don't potentially divide us into those who are in and those who are out? Which is such a sort of an almost inescapable human tendency. And here I think we can start to look at another aspect of the Baha'i writings on the spiritual path, Baha'u'llah's mystical writings, which he wrote prior to his declaration, in which he describes the stages of the spiritual journey, not as this one-step process that divides the believers from the unbelievers, but he describes it as a spiritual journey comprising many different stages, upon which everyone is at some stage or other upon this journey, and within which, and viewed from the perspective of which, every stage is true and correct within its own perspective. Our principal sources for this for this viewpoint about the spiritual journey are the tablets published in the recent volume, the Call of the Divine Beloved, which includes the 7 valleys and the 4 valleys, retranslations of the 7 valleys and 4 valleys, along with a number of additional mystical tablets that complement the themes in those mystical works. And secondly, Gems of Divine Mysteries, which was published some years prior, around 10 years ago, and which also describes, much like the Seven Valleys, a sequence of stages as a seeker ascends from a valley or city of search to those cities beyond. The interesting thing, one of the many interesting things in looking at these various parsings of the spiritual journey, is that the sequence and description of the valleys are not identical to each other. Baha'u'llah doesn't repeat the same sequence, but he varies it. It differs depending on who asked him the question and what the context of the question and the context of the questioner was. It's almost as though, taken together, it forces us to go beyond a simplistic idea that spiritual journey can be programmatically or formulaically put into a set of, a 12-step program, that's the same for everyone. Because the way Baha'u'llah describes spiritual journey is, it's different there's some differences between Gems of Divine Mysteries and the Seven Valleys. The Gems of Divine Mysteries has many of the same valleys as the Seven Valleys, but it actually adds 2 more valleys at the end, which are not in the Seven Valleys. Other tablets in Call of the Divine Beloved also go beyond valleys. The seventh valley, the final valley of the Seven Valleys, go beyond the valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness. The 4 valleys of Baha'u'llah cuts across the idea of spiritual quest in a completely different direction. Whereas the 7 valleys is describing a sequence of stages that could be traversed by one seeker throughout perhaps their spiritual lifetime. The 4 valleys describes 4 archetypes of the spiritual path, 4 different kinds of spiritual seekers. The rule follower, the logician, the lover, the mystic, and describes these as paths that people may remain on for the duration of their lives. So, of course, Baha'u'llah, these different descriptions of spiritual journey are not a total mishmash. They're not like completely, there are certain themes that are common that tend to emerge from these, although one gets, I think, the distinct idea that there's the principle of the relativity of religious truth is at play here, but one also gets a sense that there are some overarching themes that do emerge. One of these overarching themes is that the spiritual journey has something to do with traversing an initial stage of heedlessness to entering into planes of contradiction and differentiation, where one sees the distinctions. One may be inspired to various degrees, but still fundamentally sees the universe as divided into individual parts, as resolved into atomic entities. But higher planes, and in the vision of these higher planes of unity, the differences in the seeker's eyes between things begin to dissolve when one sees things in terms of essential unities, and beyond these planes of unity are planes in which names and attributes themselves become the most grievous veils between the seeker and the truth which they seek. Throughout these spiritual journeys, one is witnessing, I think, a description of the expansion of consciousness. Expansion of consciousness, which initially in the first valleys or in the first stages, one is perfectly self-centered. One's awareness of the universe is fundamentally centered around one's own good. And as one traverses these valleys and stages, the circle of one's awareness gradually expands outward until it becomes perfectly other-centered. In these final stages, the self has been burned away entirely, and all that remains is the pure light of the spirit, which is the light of consciousness shining within the soul. And this movement of the individual in their spiritual path maps onto the movement of human civilization collectively as it progresses from the smallest units, where the circles of regard are the most limited, the family unit, to gradually larger and larger circles of regard and larger aggregations of humanity at the tribal level, at the city-state level, at the nation level, and in this day, in the world level. So our spiritual awareness has to expand to keep pace with the growing interconnectedness of the body of humanity. In these final stages, the soul, I mentioned, transcends names and attributes themselves. Those are seen as veils. Among the veils that are transcended in these later valleys are the veils of the whole idea of faith and unbelief, which, going back to the city of certitude, is the whole idea of the city of certitude, that one moves from a state of unbelief to a state of faith. One makes that transition. One is spiritually reborn. At some point in the seven valleys, Baha'u'llah describes a stage where faith and denial themselves become limiting factors in the concept of faith, and the concept of denial become limiting factors that constrain one's full embrace of spiritual reality. He puts it this way, and this is in one of the new tablets in Call of the Divine Beloved. This is tablet 6, paragraph 8. He says, in all these stages, the mirror and the stages he's talking about are the early valleys. Let's say the first three valleys: a valley of search, of knowledge, of love, of knowledge. He says, in all these stages, the mirror of the wayfarer's heart may bear the reflection of shadowy desires, wayward thoughts, and worldly attachments. Wherefore hath it been said that in these stations, at one time the hosts of reason are triumphant, and at another the armies of love prevail. These tidings, however, are not constant and immutable in these stations, and the wayfarer remaineth confined between the right hand of faith and assurance and the left hand of denial and despair. Some wayfarers remain forever veiled in these stages.
Can you say that again? The wayfarer.
These tidings, however, are not constant and immutable in these stations, and the wayfarer remaineth confined between the right hand of faith and assurance and the left hand of denial and despair. Some wayfarers remain forever veiled in these stages. So there's a stage where just the faith and denial themselves become confining concepts. In these stages, the soul becomes evanescent, annihilated. It becomes nothingness, like the moth that circles the flame ever closer until its wings catch fire and its entire individuality is immolated. When one's individuality is immolated, when the pith of self has been blown out so that one becomes a hollow reed through which the inspiration flows to others, who is having the experience? Who is having the spiritual experience if the self has been annihilated? What remains to have the experience when we talk about mystical experiences? One answer is, it's actually God who's having the experience. It's not us who's having the experience. The self is gone. And the thing which is the purpose of the whole spiritual journey, is that God itself has that experience. Some of the great mystics of the past were persecuted for making such blasphemous statements. Al-Hallaj famously said, "I am the true one, I am God," and was burned at the stake for it. Some of the statements that the Bab makes, and I really believe that in the future the Bab will be seen more as now, because so little is known of the Bab and so few of the Bab's writings are translated and available, the Bab is mainly seen as a gateway to Baha'u'llah. The Bab is mainly seen as the forerunner, a prophet herald of Baha'u'llah's revelation. And I believe that as more of the Bab's mystical writings become translated and available, they will enrich more and more the Baha'i community's concepts of aspects of the spiritual journey. And one of these ways in which it enriches and I think immensely challenges us is are in these two passages, both published provisionally in English in Gate of the Heart by Nader Saidi. And on this point about who's having the experience, once the self has been annihilated in these higher stages of the spiritual journey, here's how the Bab puts it. And in doing so, he kind of blows up the whole notion of the self, and he replaces it with something else. I'll read this one. It may need to be read more than once, but let's read through it and see how it goes. He says, "It is necessary, according to true wisdom, that the pre-existent God describe himself to his creatures, that they may recognize their creator, and that out of the grace of the pre-existent, the contingent beings may attain their supreme end. This divine self-description is itself a created thing. It is unlike any other description, the sign of he is the one who hath no equal, and the truth of the servant, his true being. Whoso hath recognized it, hath recognized his Lord. This description, divine self-description, is denoted as the soul or self, and he who hath known himself hath known his Lord. At other times, it is expressed as the heart, which is the description of the divinity by the divinity, and is the essence of servitude. It is the sign of God shown by him in the world and within the souls of men, that it may be revealed unto them that verily he is the truth. Behold with the eye of thy heart, verily thy truth, the truth of thy being, is the divinity of thy Lord revealed unto thee and through thee. Thou art he himself, and he is thou thyself, except that indeed thou art that thou art, and he is that he is." Really needs to be. So this is in Gate of the Heart, page 251, and it's from a longer commentary of the Bab's. But to try to appreciate what he's doing here, he's taking the whole idea of the soul or self, which was thought to be ours, and he said, no, it's not ours. The soul or self, our true soul, our true self, is a mode of the divine self-description. Maybe another way of putting it is, we've all seen the analogy of the soul as a mirror. And you polish the mirror, and that's a virtue, and in polishing the mirror, it reflects the light of the sun. Well, the true reality of the mirror then is not the physical substrate of the mirror, but the light that's being reflected in it. That's all the Bab is saying. He's saying, what's the reality of the mirror? Not the physical thing, but it's the light that's being reflected in it. And that light being reflected in it is the light of God's wanting to be known. It's the light of the logos of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That initial primal will that wanted to be known, therefore it brought creation into being that it might become known. That's the light that emanates and is reflected within the mirrors of all things. And all things are mirrors. I mean, the human reality is a mirror of let's say, a particularly refined type, and is capable of reflecting particularly deeply and profoundly the various attributes of the Creator. But every atom, Baha'u'llah says, is a mirror of the names and attributes of God. The whole universe is, in that way, singing the praise of God, whether it realizes it or not. The whole universe is reflecting these attributes, whether it realizes it or not. And our souls, if we could really understand their true realities, when Baha'u'llah refers in the hidden words, "Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee, and within thee have I placed the essence of my light," it is God's light that is within our heart, that we think is ours. Now, what about prayer then? What does it say about prayer? Who are we praying to? In a state of evanescence, in the state of self-surrender, who's doing the praying and who's being prayed to? We have a problem there as well. It's a big problem because we have tens of thousands of prayers written in the Baha'i writings, and they're all written as though you have one entity petitioning another entity. They're all written as a servant asking the king for grace, for spiritual bounties. It is all written in this sort of transactional language, and to go on down this track is not, I think, to negate that language of prayer, which is and will continue to be a useful and powerful way of encountering the divine. I suppose one way to look at it is that it's like Newton's laws. I mean, they're 99. They are indistinguishable from Einstein's theory of general relativity, which is a lot more subtle and harder to understand in the realm of the everyday. And when we're talking about prayer, we're talking about the realm of the everyday. And it may be that there's this other way of looking at things in which one's notions of space and time just get totally blown up and upended. And that's what's happening here. Our notions of the soul, of God, of who's doing the beseeching and who's receiving it, they also get blown up in a very similar sense. This is how the Bab describes prayer and what prayer is and what true prayer is not. He says, at the level of the contingent world, true worship is realized for those who worship God through Him and submerge themselves in the sea of absolute unity. For in that sea, the worshipper and the words of worship are annihilated. And thus there remaineth not for the worshipper, but the very revelation of God and the pure countenance of the beloved. He who worshipeth God through anyone but Him, gazing at his own self as the worshipper, and at God as the object of his worship, hath joined partners with God and hath never worshipped Him. This is Words of the Bab in Gate of the Heart, pages 251 to 252. I hope there'll be a spike in the sale of Gate of the Heart after this. Let me read that once again. At the level of the contingent world, true worship is realized for those who worship God through Him and submerge themselves in the sea of absolute unity. For in that sea, the worshipper and the words of worship are annihilated. And thus there remain not for the worshipper, but the very revelation of God and the pure countenance of the beloved. He who worshipeth God through anyone but Him, by gazing at his own self as the worshipper, and at God as the object of his worship, hath joined partners with God and hath never worshipped Him. How different is this, though, from something we're familiar with in the writings of Abdu'l-Baha? This is in the prayer book. Reveal then thyself, O Lord, by thy merciful utterance and the mystery of thy divine being, that the holy ecstasy of prayer may fill our souls, a prayer that shall rise above words and letters and transcend the murmur of syllables and sounds, that all things may be merged into nothingness before the revelation of thy splendor. So I think clearly the Bab is here speaking from the perspective maybe of the Seventh Valley or beyond, it's a challenging thing, and one doesn't necessarily jump all the way there to the end at the beginning. This isn't necessarily how one introduces the topic of prayer. Maybe a safer way of introducing the topic of prayer is how Abdu'l-Baha answers the question, what is prayer? In Prayer's Talks. And he says, prayer is conversation with God. That's a good starting point. That's the Newtonian approximation. It's solid. Newton's laws will send satellites, orbiting the moon. You don't need general relativity for that. Yeah.
So in the one that you repeated, it sounded like that the person and the word and God are annihilated. The word is annihilated.
Yeah.
And you are worshiping Him as if you are one, or as if there was none. What was that last word? As if we were in unity.
Well, one of the problems is that the words themselves fail. And so part of the problem is we're trying to compress a spiritual insight into the form of words and letters. And the words necessarily take on grammatical categories. And one of the problems with these grammatical categories is that God is a noun. This is a big problem. I mean, what makes God a noun? Why isn't God in the position of a verb? God is love, right? Or the position of attributes. Abdu'l-Baha said, knowing God means the comprehension and knowledge of his attributes and not of his reality. So why isn't God an adjective? So noun, verb, adjective, or none of those. There's a problem of the grammatical categories not necessarily fitting the thing that it's supposed to be describing. And one of the biggest grammatical categories of all is the distinction between subject and object, which underlies the whole concept of prayer, is that one is a subject addressing an object. In this case, the object is vast and hopefully merciful. But if we believe the Bab, then at some level of awareness, that subject-object distinction falls away. And we're talking about fana, we're talking about annihilation. We're talking about the only when that pith of self has been completely blown out of the reed can we start talking about this kind of mystical union. But this is the same kind of mystical union which appears in every great religious tradition has its own version of this. From the Zohar to the Sufis to of course, the Buddhist and the Taoist, everyone has some version of this. It's almost a cliche, to say all is one. I've merged with the universe and all of that. That's just this. It's just, yeah. Yes, sorry. Joel.
So, in the beginning, in the Bible, we recorded this, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word is God, and the Word is with God. But in the Spanish version, translation of that, it doesn't say that. It says, in the beginning there is the verb, and the verb is God, and the verb is with God. And so that's, and the verb, I always imagined that when I read it, is the verb be, and it was. And then of course that goes back to the long obligatory prayer, but you can see where all these things kind of move together linguistically to show.
The Greek version is the original, and the word there is logos. And logos is, it means the ordering, it's an ordering principle. It also means word. Word is a perfectly good translation of it, but it means a little bit more than just word. It means an ordering principle. Like logic is order, is order manifested. Yes.
Is this the kind of thing where, so to start with your mirror, a mirror, when you break it all the way down to the two-dimensional surface, it has no actual physical reality, right? But then you go, it's a two-dimensional surface, but then you go in, is it the kind of thing where we're to conform our will to his will? We're to take on his attributes as best we can. If we keep doing these things, keep taking on his attributes, keep performing our will to his will.
Right. But in saying that sentence, you've already put his will in the category of his will. There's my will and his will. So, and this is one of the problems of language, right? You can't open your mouth and say it without already creating that division.
I'm agreeing with you, language fails us, but there's no other way to express it.
There's no other way to express it, right?
Right?
So it's a useful approximation.
But is that the idea, though?
Merging one's will with letting go.
Language utterly fails us here, but performing our will to his will, and having no will of our own.
One way to think of it, one way to think of prayer is not so much one entity asking another entity and getting an answer, but to think of prayer as a process of inner alignment with almost magnetic field lines that are flowing through all things. That's a non-objective way to think about prayer, which I find useful. Because in orienting one's inner self towards the direction of spirituality, then one is drawn downstream, so to speak. And that being drawn downstream is divine confirmation. The answer to the prayer is what happens when you're being drawn downstream and not fighting by going upstream or at cross purposes to the current of the universe. And now what we're talking about sounds a lot more like the Tao than it does, the sort of Judeo-Christian idea of an entity, invisible but ruling. But I think these two are very similar. Yes, in the back.
Could perchance this all happen in the next world also, for speaking of this entity? I mean, is this just for this existence, or is it?
Well, I hate to go there, but I mean the whole concept of the next world and this world is part of the problem as well. Right? I mean, this is another one of all the dualities are going to start falling away as one reaches sort of into the higher stages of the valleys. At the higher valleys, there is no longer a this and a that. There's no longer a this world and the next world.
Didn't you say on that circle, you're looking back or you're looking at the arc of descent?
Right, because there's only one circle, and one's traversing the circle, and so there's always a backwards and a forwards view, and that ends up being the spiritual realm and the physical realm. So in that sense, they're always well defined, but it's going to be a function of where you are in that circle, just what exactly is understood by the next world and this world. Once you've, I don't know, one example of this, in primitive, man understood the forces of nature as spiritual forces. The waves, earthquakes, lightning, all of these things, which we didn't understand the physical causes of, were relegated to the action of the gods. And as our understanding of the physical universe increased, it's almost as though we were advancing around the arc of ascent. And now things that were in front of us are now behind us, because we've advanced farther, right? So what used to be included in the spiritual world is now in our rear view mirror, and we now understand those things as physical things. We now understand lightning as an electrical discharge, caused by friction in clouds, and not Zeus's thunderbolts. And so on with so many other things that at one point seem like, so clearly divided into this and that, but then as you reach another stage, you realize that the dividing point between them has changed. And this world and the next world is one of those things. I mean, Abdu'l-Baha says it's possible to be living in that world while still alive in this world. One of the fundamental questions about the next world is this something that one only experiences after death, or is this something that one experiences upon achieving spiritual rebirth, which theoretically happens in life? And then what is the difference between that thing that one experiences upon achieving spiritual rebirth and the thing that one experiences upon dying? Is that the same realm? Are we talking about the kingdom of God in both instances? And I think part of the problem in even asking that question is that the categories are not as solid as we think they are. The categories are there for a purpose and they're approximations, but once we actually cross that dividing line into the next world, we realize that these approximations all get blown up. So, yes, there's a lot of comments, and we can use all the available time for comments. Let's take one more, and then I'll try to finish up quickly.
Martin Buber's book,
I and Now, yes.
It does a good job of establishing.
Great job of that.
Between an individual and an object, or something regarding this one.
Yes, Martin Buber has really profound things to say about this I-thou relationship between the soul and its creator. Highly recommended. And you don't have to read the whole book. There's even like article length. I and Thou. Yeah, have a search on that. Martin Buber, B-U-B-E-R. He was a Jewish philosopher / theologian. So, how can we sum this up? The human spiritual or mystical experience is the experience of the divine. This sentence can be grammatically read in two different ways. Our experience is experiencing the divine. One can also read that same sentence as, it is the divine having a human mystical experience. So that's one way of summarizing it in a way that preserves kind of both sides of it. Without having to choose grammatically which side one leans towards. You can say the human's mystical experience is the experience of the divine, and you get both of them kind of kill two birds with one stone. So we've said, I think we may have heard the phrase, are we bodies having a spiritual experience, or are we spirit having a bodily experience? And I think this principle of complementarity that we talked about a couple of days ago suggests that both can easily be true. We don't have to choose one or the other. It's a matter of one's perspective. And viewing things, well, maybe this is actually, I have a lot more to say, but there's a lot of directions to give. Maybe this is enough. I don't know. Have I done enough?
I think you're good for now.
Are we good for now?
I see exploding heads. So.
Let me just finish with this thought, that maybe the point of the spiritual journey is not achieving a particular goal, enlightenment, heaven, and then coming to rest in that state. Maybe the point is not experiencing a particular mystical feeling of being one with everything, the momentary thrill of the living waters being poured down from above. If it were about the experience, there are ways of getting there chemically. That's just the fact. If one wants to have a spiritual experience, there are chemical ways of doing it. And that tells me that it's probably not about the experience then. The spirituality is not about the spiritual feelings. Shoghi Effendi addresses this question of experience versus reality, and he says, if we thought about religion as experience, he said it renders religion the religion of the few, the religion of only those who have experiences, and that's not how we conceive of it. So maybe then the point of the spiritual journey is the journey itself, because the journey is not a single step from the land of misbelief into the land of faith. The journey is endless because the degrees of spiritual progress are endless, and the pathway back to the source is infinite. But every journey does begin with a single step, going back to the city of certitude. The entrance to the city of certitude is real. That's the first step in the spiritual journey, and that is the step of faith. So tomorrow we will try to wrap up. We won't wrap up. We're actually going to introduce a whole other topic. But it's going to be trying to take the idea of the circle of existence and apply it to our collective humans in various collective ways. So touching on questions of political organization and world order and so forth, and the role of the prophets. I haven't talked much about prophets yet, about manifestation. So that's coming tomorrow as well. So thank you.
Thanks.